This next video is about Mannerism in painting and in sculpture and a little bit of architecture, and then moving into the Counter-Reformation and how art changes as a reaction against Mannerism. So first off, starting with Mannerism, Mannerism is often seen as a reaction to the High Renaissance style. So the High Renaissance style is seen as beautiful and harmonious, colors that work well together, while Mannerism is seen as a little bit different than that. So we see a concentration on the nude, lots of fleshy figures, lots of bodies all over the place, and lots of different positions with bizarre and convoluted poses, exaggerated muscular development, possibly as a way of building on some of the bodies and types that were being put forth by Michelangelo. The subject matter either becomes deliberately obscure or treated so that it becomes difficult to understand. So it's not all about clarity. What we saw in the High Renaissance, and even some cases in the early Renaissance, it was all about making things easy and clear to understand, making narratives clear, helping the viewer along. With Mannerism, things become a little bit more complicated. There are extremes of perspective, distorted proportions or scale, vivid color schemes, and discordant contrasts. So colors that aren't really very natural, or colors that don't work well together, in really bright, vivid ways. So Mannerism is seen as, maniera means style, so it's kind of this very stylish style. It's this very exaggerated style. And so we'll focus on a few paintings, and we'll get into sculpture and a little of architecture. But most often it's seen as kind of working against some of the main principles of the High Renaissance. So if we look at this example by Parmigianino, this is the Madonna of the long neck, where we see some of these exaggerated proportions. Her large lower body, which is distracting, the extremely elongated Christ that extends across her lap, of course her long neck, for which the painting is named, her extremely long fingers, her very small upper body. The Virgin, of course, is huge, which speaks to her importance, but then there's this tiny little man off to the side. This isn't a completed painting. You can see that it's not quite done yet, but you can see there's some kind of temple being constructed, this kind of endless row of columns with a man who kind of looks like an architect off to the side in classical style costume. So it's just a painting that doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense at first view, demonstrating a move away from the clarity of the High Renaissance and the idea of perfect proportions or harmonious proportions that are pleasing to the eye. In this case, we're really not seeing that. The Virgin was often seen as a vessel for Christ, so we have this angel figure holding out a vessel, the idea that she's the vessel of the body of Christ. But we also see some kind of sexy elements, these erotic elements that sometimes come into these Mannerist paintings. So this angel is exposing the leg here in a very fleshy kind of way. The body of the Virgin is being revealed under the drapery. We can see here her belly button. So just a few unusual elements that speak to the prominence of the nude and the body. Probably the most famous Mannerist painting is this example. So it's Venus, Cupid, Folly, and Time, or the Allegory of Lust. Is this an exposure of incest where we see mother and son together, or is Venus just disarming Cupid in a very strategic way? So here we see Venus with her body pushed forward into the foreground, pale and looking very sculptural, and then the body of Cupid, who's not a little baby here. He's more kind of an adolescent, and his bottom is pointing towards us, whereas Venus's front is facing towards us. We know it's Venus. She's wearing a crown, but also she's holding onto the golden apple, which was her reward for the judgment of Paris for being the most beautiful of the goddesses. And we see she's removing an arrow from Cupid. And then we see a lot of figures around that are very complex. So we see Folly here, who's about to throw rose petals on them. A figure who represents fraud, who's very sweet, beautiful young girl holding honeycomb. Sweet, sweet, sweet. And then she has this monstrous body behind her. We see a figure of Time possibly revealing the scene, a figure of jealousy tearing out her hair, or possibly representative of syphilis, which was a sexually transmitted disease that was really ravaging Italy and France during this period. So it's a very, again, a complex scene, an emphasis on fleshy, nude bodies, an emphasis on sensuality, and so this is all very common in Mannerism. It was given to Francis I, probably by Cosimo I de' Medici, who became Duke of Florence, and so what we see here is a gift from one ruler to another. Clearly both would have been very educated and would have wanted this kind of complex subject matter, and Francis seemed to have preferred this kind of erotic subject matter as well. Another artist that worked for Cosimo de' Medici was Cellini, Benvenuto Cellini, who wrote his own autobiography. And one of the pieces that was featured was his Perseus and Medusa. So Perseus is a Greek hero who killed Medusa, and we see him here after the moment where he's cut off her head and he's holding it up. And this is a sculpture that demonstrates some Mannerist tendencies in the fact that you need to walk all the way around it. We'll see this with some Baroque sculptures as well. But the idea that you need to interact with it at multiple angles, in this case you would walk on this side and see Perseus with his muscular kind of contrapposto stance. But as you walked around, you would see the headless body of Medusa with the blood, the appearance of blood pouring out at you. Another thing to note is that this is just a really impressive bronze sculpture in the fact that it has so much detail, and Cellini was very proud of it in the fact that when he did the pour, when the bronze was poured into the mold, it was able to get all of the small details that are included on this image. So Mannerism in sculpture, a Mannerist statue must be walked all around, and all of its angles of view are equally important. We see this too with another work by Cellini, which thankfully was never melted down. It is made out of gold. It was a very expensive work, and it was also a gift to Francis I, just like the Bronzino work that we just saw. It too is very sensual. We see a figure representing the sea, looking kind of like Poseidon, gesturing with his trident in a kind of a phallic way, and then we also see the figure here representing the land, touching her breast, and with their feet intertwined, the way the sea and the land might meet at the shore. And this is actually a very fancy, basically salt and pepper holder. And so you would have your salt over in this boat here, you would have the pepper held in the triumphal arch, and so this is a very, very luxurious type of element that you would put to adorn your table. And what we see during the Renaissance is very, very fancy types of table adornment, and this one done in a particularly Mannerist style by Cellini. As we move into Mannerism in architecture, what we're seeing here is a pleasure palace for Federico Gonzaga, Federico II Gonzaga, and he was Duke of Mantua, son of Isabella d'Este, and what we see here are a few things that are a little bit unexpected. So things like triglyphs falling, things like keystones that are too large. So Mannerist architecture just does a few things that you might not traditionally expect of architecture. Architecture tends to follow very strict rules, and in Mannerist architecture you see some of these rules being played around with. The most inventive room inside the Palazzo del Te is the Room of the Giants, and what we see here is a battle between the Olympian gods and the giants, the very famous battle that's been retold in many movies and stories. And what we see here is a room that's essentially been turned into a dome with kind of this churning floor, and the illusion here is that there's almost an earthquake happening as this battle is raging. So we see the giants down below. You can see here's one about to be crushed by these stones, and you see these columns about to collapse, and then the Olympian gods are featured up in the ceiling. And what Giulio Romano is doing, Giulio Romano was a student of Raphael, is he's come to the city of Mantua where Andrea Mantegna had worked, had painted rooms, and he's trying to create a room that will really interact with the viewer, where the viewer will be really impressed, where it looks like the room's almost collapsing in on itself. So that's the idea with this room. It's very hard to see in a painting, but when you see it more in person, you get the sense of this room collapsing in on itself. So as we move towards the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, just a few historical events. So Martin Luther, very important, of course, in the Protestant Reformation. 1517, he posts his 95 Theses against indulgences, which were being sold by the church, and against the corruption of the clergy. Raphael dies in 1520, which is essentially seen as the end of the High Renaissance, more or less. We have Pope Leo X Medici, who dies in 1521. He had essentially ignored the Protestant Reformation going on, the Protestant protests, essentially. You have another Medici Pope elected, and eventually, while he is ruling, Rome will be sacked by the troops of the Emperor Charles V, which really shows that Rome, and as a Catholic center and as a center that had been respected, is really losing its importance, its centrality in Europe, and is no longer as respected. So one of the reasons the church was selling so many indulgences and why Martin Luther was so upset about them was the large project of the rebuilding of St. Peter's, which was the important church of the Vatican right next to the papal palace. And so Michelangelo's suggestion was to make more of a central plan. Eventually they'll extend the nave to fit more people in the Counter-Reformation, but his focus is on a beautiful dome, a beautiful segmented dome, indicating his Florentine heritage. So they will create his dome. It will become a little bit more elongated, but you can see his contributions in the apse and in the dome, where he's really turning architecture into sculpture. He's carving out areas. He's adding decoration that isn't typically part of architecture, almost in a Mannerist style, adding little curving elements and little boxes that look like windows but aren't even functioning as windows. So the idea here is to carve out the space in a very elaborate fashion, but it also demonstrates just how large this project was, and also how expensive it would have been, and how they would have had to sell so many indulgences in order to fund this project, leading to the Reformation and then eventually the Counter-Reformation on the Catholic side. So thinking about the Counter-Reformation, which was the Catholic Church's response to the Protestant concerns. So the Catholic Church realizes it has to make reforms, and this includes in the production of its art. If we think about that Mannerist art with all its fleshy bodies and eroticism, we think about that the church feels like they need to make some changes. So the Catholic stand on art came in the Council of Trent, came near the end of the Council of Trent, and what were these recommendations? So here are a few of them. So first off, images of the divine should not be worshipped as divine. So images of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints shouldn't be worshipped as idols. The images should be used to teach true doctrines of the Catholic faith, nothing invented by the artist, and that it should avoid superstition, lasciviousness, seductive charm, boisterous festivities, or drunkenness, and that there should be decency and clarity, and that figures should not be confusedly arranged. So this last section really indicates that this is coming after the style of Mannerism and trying to fix it. So one of the paintings where we saw quite a bit of trouble, the artist Veronese, who's from the north, got in trouble when he named this painting the Last Supper, or created a Last Supper for the refectory, the area where the monks would eat, in San Giovanni e Paolo, which was a church in Venice. So it's a large refectory. He needed to fill a lot of space, so he takes the Last Supper and he essentially turns it into an elaborate party. The Inquisition has some problems with this. Eventually he renames it, but they have issues with the drunkenness. There are Germans in there, and the Germans are ones that are protesting. Dwarves are mentioned, a man with a bloody nose. There are just too many figures that are distracting from the religious subject matter. So what we see here is an occasion where an artist gets in trouble for pushing the subject matter a little bit too far, using his artistic license. And what Veronese refers to as a way to try to get out of it is he actually refers to Michelangelo's Last Judgment, which was something that Michelangelo painted in the Sistine Chapel a number of years after he completed his first painting of the ceiling. So he actually goes back a little over 20 years later, and he creates this image of the Last Judgment. And these figures are nude and fleshy and very much in that Mannerist style. We see Christ as judge at center with the Virgin next to him, and we see that he's pushing figures down into the hellfires, and then certain figures are being saved. And so it's a very dramatic scene, but mostly these figures are just very, very nude and fleshy. And so Veronese discusses that in his defense. He says, but what about Michelangelo's painting with all those nude figures? And the people in the Inquisition say, well, in the Last Judgment, everyone's going to be nude. But what's interesting is a few years later, they actually send someone in to add little breeches and little coverings on these nude figures so that they are covered up and the genitals are no longer revealed in this very holy chapel. So what we see during the Counter-Reformation is a response to Mannerism and a reaction against some of its stylistic features.